March 1882. Two cave explorers crawl into a limestone hollow in the Kentucky mountains. 60 feet down, they find blankets, animal bones, scratch marks on the wall. Then they see it, carved into stone. Sarah Calloway is here. Sarah vanished 4 years ago. She was 7 years old. They're about to leave when they hear it. Singing, a child's voice echoing from deep in the cave. Amazing grace. Faint, hollow, impossible. What they pulled out of that darkness would expose a secret so disturbing, authorities refused to write it down. This is the story of Sarah Margaret Calloway and the father who erased her. Deep Appalachia, Clay County, Kentucky. A place where federal law didn't reach and family business stayed family business. The Calloway farm sat isolated in the mountains, 3 generations of tobacco farmers living by codes older than America itself. Ezekiel Calloway, 42, sick respected, God-fearing. His youngest daughter Sarah had dark hair and her mother's cautious eyes. Neighbors called her quite obedient. November 14, 1878. Sarah disappeared. The community searched for 3 weeks. 23 men. They dragged creeks, combed forests, found nothing. Her parents accepted the inevitable. The mountains had claimed another child. They held a memorial service without a body. Life went on. But here's what they didn't know. 2 years later, the 1880 census listed the Calloway family. 6 children became 5. Sarah's name had been erased from the record. Not dead, erased. 3 months after Sarah vanished, a traveling preacher stayed at the Calloway home. Reverend Thomas Albright. His journal, now in the Kentucky Historical Society, describes something he couldn't name. Martha Calloway, uncommonly anxious. Ezekiel forbidding any mention of the missing daughter, the children speaking only in whispers. He wrote, "There hangs over this home a darkness I cannot name. I departed at first light, though I could not say why haste possessed me." The school teacher noticed something too. Sarah hadn't attended class since early October, a full month before her reported disappearance. When she mentioned this during the search, Martha explained Sarah had been sick with fever. The teacher later wrote to her sister, "Mrs. Calloway would not meet my eyes. When I asked if Sarah had recovered, she simply said the Lord had other plans." During the search, Ezekiel joined the parties. But neighbors noticed something off. He kept directing them toward the river, away from the eastern ridge. One searcher testified, "Seemed more concerned with where we should not look than where we should." The search ended in December. Snow fell. The community moved on, but the Calloway children didn't. Jacob, the eldest son, fled to West Virginia in 1880. Never came back, never wrote home. When investigators contacted him years later, he sent one response: "Some things are best left buried. I pray God has mercy on all our souls." And Elizabeth, 13, married at 15, unusually young even for mountain standards. She moved to the next county. Escaped. Mary stopped attending church, withdrew completely. One by one, the Calloway children separated themselves from their parents, fled or disappeared into silence. Summer 1881, 3 years after Sarah vanished. A new family, the Hendersons, moved onto land adjoining the Calloway farm, the Eastern Ridge, the same ridge Ezekiel had steered searchers away from. Robert Henderson started clearing timber. He found something, a well-worn path leading from the Calloway property deep into the ridge forest. Man-made, maintained, recently traveled. His wife mentioned it to Martha Calloway during a visit. Martha's reaction was immediate. Violent. She stood so fast she spilled her tea. Said the path was for gathering ginseng root. Then she fled the house without another word. Henderson later said, "Like a woman fleeing judgment itself." Then the Hendersons' livestock started disappearing. Chickens, a piglet. Robert suspected foxes until his son found a footprint near the pen. Barefoot, human, a child. He confronted Ezekiel, accused one of his children of stealing. Ezekiel exploded, threatened violence, said his children were well, Fen would never steal. The men nearly fought. After that, Henderson set traps, kept watch. The theft stopped. Winter came. 1882 arrived. Sarah Calloway had been gone for over 3 years. March 16, 1882. Marcus and Daniel Webb, cave explorers from Virginia, descended into Devil's Hollow Cave on the eastern ridge. They carried lanterns and rope, expected limestone formations and underground streams. 60 feet in, the second chamber, they found blankets, threadbare but man-made, small animal bones scattered around fire pits, scratches on the cave wall, primitive marks like someone counting days, and a corn-husk doll, the kind mountain children made. They assumed a drifter, maybe a fugitive. They pushed deeper. The third chamber, human waste covered with dirt, a tin cup, cloth fragments, once a dress. Then Marcus saw it, carved into the limestone. Sarah Calloway is here. He thought they'd found a grave, a murder scene. They turned to leave. That's when they heard it. From somewhere deeper in the cave system, singing, a child's voice, Amazing Grace. Young, female, echoing through stone. Daniel called out. The singing stopped. They heard movement. Something retreating into darkness. Marcus shouted they meant no harm, silence. Only dripping water and their own breathing. They faced a choice. Chase whatever was down there or get help. They chose help. They marked the entrance with stones and ran. Sheriff Benjamin Tucker didn't believe them. A child surviving alone in a cave for 3 years. Impossible. But the carving, Sarah Calloway is here, gave him enough reason to investigate. March 17, 1882. 10 a.m. Sheriff Tucker and 6 men entered Devil's Hollow Cave. Multiple lanterns. Rope. Weapons. Ready for anything. The first 2 chambers matched the cousin's description. Then Tucker noticed something they'd missed. Small piles of stones along the cave wall. Deliberately placed. Markers leading deeper. They followed them. The passage narrowed. They crawled through sections where the ceiling dropped to 3 feet. The air thinned. Temperature dropped. Then the passage opened into a 4th chamber. And there in the far corner, illuminated by 6 lanterns, a child. Barely recognizable as human. Hair in matted tangles to her waist, skin pale as death, translucent from years without sunlight. Rags that might have been a dress, bare feet, heavily calloused, eyes huge and round, reflecting lamplight like an animal's. When the men moved forward, she screamed and pressed herself against the wall. Tucker stopped them. Knelt down. Spoke softly. She just stared. He tried again. Are you Sarah Calloway? At that name, something shifted in her face. Recognition. Or the ghost of recognition. She nodded. Robert Henderson had seen Sarah before she disappeared. He later testified he wouldn't have identified her. She looked 5, not 11. Severe malnutrition had stunted her growth. Teeth damaged. Body covered in scars. But her eyes, Martha Calloway's eyes, dark and cautious. It took an hour to get her out. She was terrified, refused to be touched. Finally, Tucker left his coat near her and backed away. Slowly, she crept forward. Took it, wrapped herself in it step by step. They coaxed her toward the exit. When they emerged into daylight, Sarah collapsed. The sun was too bright. She covered her eyes and made sounds that weren't words, distressed animal calls. They wrapped her in blankets. Offered water. She gulped it desperately. Offered food. She stuffed it in her mouth with both hands, no regard for choking. The questions came fast. How had she survived? How long had she been there? And the most important question, how did she get there? The cave was 15 miles from the Calloway farm through brutal terrain. A 7-year-old couldn't make that journey alone. Someone took her. Someone knew she was there, and the evidence of sustained habitation meant someone had been keeping her alive. Tucker made a decision. Take Sarah to Dr. James Whitfield in Manchester. She needed medical attention, and they needed her testimony. Dr. Whitfield's examination produced a report that still exists in the Clay County archives. Disturbing reading. Sarah weighed 45 pounds at age 11, the weight of a 6-year-old. Rickets from vitamin deficiency. Multiple healed fractures in her fingers and toes. Scar tissue on her back, consistent with repeated strikes from a belt or switch. Verbal capacity severely diminished. She could make sounds but couldn't form sentences. Dr. Whitfield wrote, "She exhibits behaviors more consistent with an abused animal than a human child. She wouldn't make eye contact, flinched at sudden movements, hoarded food, hiding pieces in her clothing, but Sarah could communicate. Through gestures and drawings, she began to tell her story." Dr. Whitfield's wife Ellen, a former teacher, worked patiently with her. What emerged over 3 days was a narrative so horrific, Sheriff Tucker struggled to believe it. Sarah hadn't vanished that November day. She'd been taken by her father. Ezekiel told her they were collecting herbs for her sick mother. She trusted him. He led her into the mountains, brought her to the cave, left her there with blankets and scraps of food, and he told her if she ever left, if she ever tried to come home, something terrible would happen to her mother and siblings. He returned periodically. Sarah couldn't say how often. She had no way to track time in constant darkness. Sometimes every few days, sometimes long stretches with nothing. He brought food, spoiled scraps, animal carcasses she had to cook over fires he'd build. He brought warnings, threats about disobedience, and according to Sarah's gestures and Ellen's horrified understanding, he did other things that explained the pattern of injuries, things Dr. Whitfield recorded in clinical Latin that barely concealed the evil. 3 years. Sarah lived in those caves, seeing sunlight only when her father opened the entrance. She survived on what he brought and small animals she could trap near the cave mouth. The corn husk doll, a gift from an early visit. Some twisted pretense of paternal care. The scratches on the wall, her attempts to count days until she lost track and gave up. The stolen livestock from the Henderson farm made sense now. As her father's visits became less frequent, Sarah ventured out more. She learned which farms were closest, developed survival skills like a wild creature, took what she needed, retreated back to the only home she knew, darkness. Why didn't she escape? Why didn't she walk to any house and ask for help? Ellen Whitfield believed the answer lay in systematic psychological destruction. Ezekiel convinced Sarah she was protecting her family by staying hidden. Told her she was bad, cursed, that her presence brought danger to everyone. He created a prison with no locks because his daughter believed she deserved to be there. March 20th, Sheriff Tucker rode to the Callaway farm with 4 deputies and arrest warrants. They found Ezekiel in his tobacco field, preparing soil for spring planting. When told he was under arrest for kidnapping and abuse, Ezekiel denied everything, claimed Sarah had disappeared, insisted he'd searched like any father would, suggested whoever was in that cave was some other child. An orphan, a runaway giving a false name. Martha Callaway was questioned separately. Her response was different but equally damning. She admitted she knew Sarah was alive, admitted Ezekiel had taken their daughter to the mountains, but claimed she thought it was temporary, punishment for some disobedience she couldn't articulate. She said she'd asked about Sarah in the early months. Ezekiel told her the girl was learning obedience. As time passed, Martha became afraid to ask. Afraid of her husband. Afraid of what knowing might require her to do. The other children were questioned. William and Mary claimed they thought Sarah had died. The older children told more complicated truths. Jacob, reached by telegram, refused to return to Kentucky, sent a statement, "My father is a devil in man's form. I left home to escape becoming like him." Thomas confirmed everyone in the family knew Sarah hadn't simply disappeared. He didn't know where she'd been taken, but he knew their father left regularly with supplies, knew they were all forbidden to speak about Sarah under threat of violence. Elizabeth provided the most detailed testimony. Her mother had told her privately that Sarah was being kept away from sin and temptation, and that it was God's will. Elizabeth said she'd been so desperate to leave home, so terrified of suffering Sarah's fate, that she accepted the first marriage proposal offered. A man 15 years older, she barely knew. The case against Ezekiel was overwhelming, but unprecedented. There was no clear legal framework. Could a father kidnap his own daughter? Assault charges existed, but proving systematic long-term abuse based on a traumatized child's testimony was legally complex. Ezekiel was held in jail. Trial scheduled for June 1882. Martha wasn't arrested. Prosecutors said they needed her as a witness. Others believed she was as guilty, maybe more. A mother's failure to protect seemed to violate something deeper than law. Sarah remained with the Whitfields. They worked to rehabilitate her, reintroduce her to society and speech. Progress was slow. She learned to tolerate indoor spaces, but preferred sleeping outside, started speaking in simple sentences. Sarah hungry. Sarah scared. Dark place bad. As she drew pictures of the cave obsessively. Always a small stick figure in the corner, a larger menacing figure at the entrance. Ellen kept the drawings. They're part of the historical record now. Heartbreaking artifacts of a shattered childhood. June 12, 1882. The trial began. 6 days. A sensation throughout eastern Kentucky. People traveled miles to attend. The courthouse couldn't hold everyone. The Louisville Courier Journal ran a front-page article. Mountain monster father accused of unthinkable cruelty. The prosecution presented medical testimony. Cave discovery statements. The stolen livestock. The child's footprint. Then they presented Sarah. 30 minutes only. Shielded from the audience, sitting with Ellen, she identified Ezekiel as her father. Nodded when asked if he took her to the cave. Started crying when asked to describe what happened. The judge ruled she couldn't be questioned further. The defense strategy was simple, and by 1882 standards, potentially effective. Ezekiel's attorney argued fathers had absolute authority over their children under civil law and biblical doctrine. Cited scripture about discipline. Suggested Sarah was disobedient, possibly mentally defective, requiring isolation for her own good. Painted Ezekiel as a strict but godly man raising children in harsh wilderness. Implied the real crime was erosion of paternal authority in modern society. This found sympathy among some jurors. Mountain culture granted fathers almost unlimited household power. Children were property, managed as the father saw fit. The state rarely interfered. What Ezekiel did, though extreme, wasn't entirely outside accepted harsh discipline. But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence. They called Martha to testify. She'd been granted immunity. On the stand, she revealed something she hadn't told investigators. Ezekiel had done this before. Sarah wasn't the first child he'd taken to the caves. There had been another daughter, Ruth, born between Jacob and Thomas. The family reported she died in infancy, but Martha testified Ruth actually lived to age 4. Ezekiel decided she was touched by the devil because she cried constantly and wouldn't obey. He took Ruth to a cave, intended to keep her temporarily to break her spirit. Ruth died within 2 weeks. Ezekiel buried her somewhere in the mountains. No grave registered. No death certificate. Ruth had simply been erased. This changed everything. One child might be explained as terrible judgment. 2 children suggested a pattern. Deliberate cruelty. Ezekiel had developed a system for dealing with children who didn't meet his standards. That system involved removing them from the world entirely. The jury deliberated 11 hours. June 18, 1882. Guilty. Unlawful imprisonment. Aggravated assault. Contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The kidnapping charge didn't stick, a technicality based on paternal rights. But the guilty verdicts were significant. 20 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. Ezekiel showed no emotion, made no statement of remorse. His only words to his attorney, "A man's children belong to him, to do with as he sees fit." He was transported to Frankfort within the week. Died in prison 11 years later in 1893. Tuberculosis. His body wasn't returned to Clay County. Martha lived the rest of her life in isolation. The community shunned her. Her children, except Mary, cut off all contact. She stayed on the farm 2 more years, struggling alone, before selling and moving to Ohio. Died in 1904. Her obituary made no mention of her children or her Kentucky life. Sarah's fate is more ambiguous. Ellen wanted to adopt her, but legal complications made it impossible. Sarah was technically still Martha's child, and Martha, despite everything, refused to relinquish parental rights. Eventually a compromise. Sarah was placed with Ellen's sister in Tennessee, far from the mountains and memories. The arrangement was informal, undocumented, designed to make Sarah difficult to find if Martha tried to reclaim her. Letters between Ellen and her sister, preserved by descendants, provide glimpses of Sarah's later life. She learned to read and write, though never fluently. Remained uncomfortable around men and crowds. Had nightmares about darkness and confinement. But she also experienced joy. Learned to garden. Helped care for foster cousins. Attended church, though she struggled with theology that had been used to justify her suffering. Sarah married at 19. A widower named Thomas Brennan, a quiet carpenter. She had 2 children, both daughters, protected them with fierce devotion. She never spoke publicly about her ordeal. When the Louisville Courier-Journal tried to interview her in 1895, she declined. Her written response, delivered through her husband, "I am not that child anymore. I am building a different life." Sarah Calloway Brennan died in 1924, age 53, buried in a small cemetery outside Nashville. Her gravestone reads, "Sarah Brennan, beloved wife and mother, 1871-1904. No maiden name, no reference to her past, just the simple fact of her existence. Perhaps exactly what she wanted, to be remembered not for what was done to her, but for who she chose to become." The case left lasting impact on Kentucky law. 1885, the state legislature passed the Callaway Act, clarified that parental authority did not extend to imprisonment, starvation, or sexual abuse of children. Established that children had independent rights the state could protect against their own parents. One of the first child protection laws in Kentucky, born directly from Sarah's suffering. Devil's Hollow Cave became a dark tourism site for years. People hiked to see where the cave girl lived. Eventually, local families, disgusted by morbid curiosity, sealed the entrance with rocks, posted warnings about unstable passages. Today, the exact location is largely forgotten, known only to a few historians and spelunkers. The broader significance of Sarah's story lies in what it reveals about family privacy, paternal authority, and community complicity in the late 19th century. Sarah didn't disappear without a trace. People saw signs, felt unease, but cultural norms about not interfering in family matters, respecting a father's right to discipline his children as he saw fit, created an environment where suspicions didn't translate into action. The Reverend felt darkness in the Calloway home. Prayed about it. Did nothing. Miss Hensley questioned Martha's explanation. Didn't push further. Robert Henderson noticed the mysterious path, assumed it was none of his business. Sarah's siblings knew something terrible was happening. Felt powerless to stop it. The most haunting aspect isn't that Sarah was taken. It's that she was taken in plain sight. Remained invisible for 4 years, not because no one could have found her, but because no one challenged the authority structure that made her disappearance possible. Sarah Calloway's story reminds us that history's darkest chapters often hide in plain sight, protected by the very social structures meant to provide order and stability. The mountains of Appalachia kept many secrets in the 1800s, but Sarah's was among the most devastating. It revealed how easily a child could be erased when a community chose not to see. If you found this story compelling, you might be interested in the Tennessee orphan train children or the asylum scandal of 1891. Subscribe for more forgotten dark history. Consider supporting this channel. Until next time, remember, the past is never quite what it seems.